I went camping when I was younger, from the calm of 1999. This adventure began when I used to reside in a small town in Arkansas with a population of around 5,000. It was your average conservative town, where summers were hot and humid, and winters were dark and cold. My upbringing was steeped in southern entertainment, driving four-wheelers, hunting every deer season, and perhaps indulging in a bit of trapping here and there. This particular story unfolded during my last year of high school, when I was 17 years old. I had plenty of friends, a great girlfriend, and an old shabby 1972 F-100 Ford pickup, which I still cherish to this day. It was November, rifle season, and I had been preparing for it meticulously. My friend Drew and I had meticulously planned this trip, and everything was set. It was a Friday, marking the end of the week and the beginning of the weekend. Our plan was simple: hike up through the national forest onto the mountain and set up camp, immersing ourselves in the wilderness. I woke at 3 o'clock in the morning, leaving a note for my parents and loading my belongings into the bed of my truck. With a sense of anticipation, I hopped into the driver's seat and made my way to Drew's house. Upon arrival, Drew was already waiting on the porch. He swiftly stowed his bag in the bed of the truck, then carefully placed his gun inside. With everything in order, we embarked on our journey to the mountain. As we entered the turn that led to the entrance of the hiking site, the transition from road to dirt felt as familiar as ever. We parked the truck, shouldered our bags, and began our ascent up the mountain trail. Thanks to the sun shining over the trees, visibility was excellent, and the chirping of birds filled the air. Squirrels scampered through the trees, engaged in their morning chatter. After about 3 hours of hiking, we reached the campsite indicated on our map. Without delay, we set up tarps and gathered firewood to kindle a warm fire. I volunteered to procure lunch and set off with my rifle in hand. I trekked south for at least half a mile until I broke through the tree line. Taking a seat underneath a majestic oak tree, I scanned the surroundings for any signs of movement while the sun gradually ascended in the sky. I was sitting there when all the birds suddenly stopped, and for a moment, the silence became deafening. There was a sharp ringing in my ears, sending shivers down my spine. Slowly, I began to scan my surroundings, ensuring I stayed as still as possible. It was eerie, to say the least. Then, I noticed a deer standing at the other side of the field. It was difficult to make out at first, but I could see its silhouette against the backdrop of the forest. With cautious movements, I raised my rifle and peered down the hill. Only the deer's head and neck were visible from where I sat. I hesitated, knowing that if I took the shot, I might not get another chance for a cleaner kill. Besides, it was just a doe, a less desirable target. As I deliberated, something caught my attention. The deer's head seemed higher off the ground than usual, and its movements were unnatural. It turned abruptly to the left, the sound of leaves crunching beneath its hooves echoing through the silence. A sense of unease settled over me, prompting me to abandon my hunt and head back to camp. Following the mental landmarks I had noted earlier, a fallen tree, a dried-up creek bed, I eventually spotted the tarps of our campsite through the trees. Upon my return, we whiled away the rest of the day, hunting rabbits and tending to the fire. As night fell, we retired to our tents, exhausted from the day's adventures. Sleep came swiftly, but when we awoke the next morning, the eerie atmosphere persisted. The air felt heavy, and an unsettling silence enveloped the forest. There were no sounds of animals, no signs of life, just an oppressive stillness. Feeling hungry, we ventured out separately, hoping to find some game. As the day wore on, our efforts proved fruitless, and we reluctantly settled for canned beans for dinner. As we sat by the fire, Drew excused himself to relieve himself. Minutes turned into an agonizing wait, and just as concern began to gnaw at me, I heard the unmistakable sound of leaves crunching in the distance. I turned towards the sound, expecting to see Drew approaching. However, when he emerged from the shadows, his face was ghostly pale. Without a word, He motioned for me to follow him deeper into the woods. "What's going on, man?" I asked, but he simply kept insisting, his silence unnerving. Feeling a sense of dread creeping over me, I reluctantly rose to my feet and followed him. We walked for what felt like an eternity, the darkness of the forest swallowing us whole. Suddenly, a putrid stench assaulted my senses, growing stronger with each step we took. It was a sickening smell, like death itself, and I struggled to keep from retching. As we ventured further into the woods, the smell intensified until it was nearly unbearable. Then, something heavy landed on my shoulder, and I recoiled in horror as I felt it ooze down my back. The stench grew even stronger, and I gagged, bile rising in my throat. Summoning all my courage, I pulled out my flashlight and aimed it at the ground. What I saw made my blood run cold. Blood was dripping from the branches above, pooling on the forest floor below. My hands shook as I slowly raised the beam of light, revealing a gruesome sight. Parts of animals hung from the trees, their mangled bodies swaying in the breeze. Organs, limbs, and pieces of flesh littered the ground, a macabre tapestry of death. I felt bile rise in my throat, and I turned to Drew, his face ashen with fear. Without a word, we turned and fled, our footsteps echoing through the silent forest. Back at camp, we tried to make sense of what we had seen, but the horror of it all was too much to bear. As we gathered our belongings, the sound of crunching leaves filled the air, sending a shiver down my spine. With trembling hands, I grabbed my rifle, my heart pounding in my chest. I aimed my flashlight towards the source of the noise, but there was nothing there. Just the oppressive darkness of the forest, closing in around us. But then, without warning, a grotesque, elongated hand emerged from the shadows, reaching towards us with clawed fingers. With a cry of terror, we turned and fled, our lungs burning with exertion. We ran as if our lives depended on it, desperate to escape the nightmare that lurked in the darkness of the woods. As I ran, panic coursing through my veins, I couldn't help but glance back to check on Drew and ensure he was close behind me. With my flashlight switched off, I relied on the moonlight to guide my way, just as Drew did. We pressed ourselves against a tree, trying to blend into the darkness, but I could see Drew's breaths in the cold night air, visible in the faint moonlight. My eyes gradually adjusted to the darkness, and that's when I saw the long, bony arm coated in blood, its fingers adorned with unkempt, curved nails. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched in horror as the arm gripped Drew's shoulder, his screams echoing through the silent forest. I was frozen in place, unable to move as I witnessed my friend being dragged across the forest floor, his screams gradually fading into the night. Then, there was silence, utter, deafening silence. With a surge of adrenaline, I picked myself up and ran, but my escape was short-lived as I tripped over something, tumbling downhill before crashing into a tree. Pain shot through my back, and I realized I had twisted my ankle in the fall. Despite the agony, I forced myself to stay still, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the creature that had taken Drew. Before long, I heard the sound of leaves shuffling, and I saw it strange, jagged, and tense, moving through the woods with an unnatural grace. Its thin, malnourished form seemed to writhe in agony with every movement, bones rubbing against its skin from the inside. As it drew closer, I could make out its features: the elongated chin, the beady yellow eyes surrounded by dark circles of skin, the mouth stretched wide with jagged, broken teeth. Its eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, and its mouth and nose were smeared with a viscous red fluid that trailed down its torso. Frozen with fear, I watched as it sniffed the forest floor, hunting for me. With dread coursing through my veins, I realized it had caught my scent. As it turned towards me and began to crawl on all fours, I knew that I had to move or become its next victim. I recoiled at the putrid stench, reminiscent of roadkill, and felt bile rise in my throat once again. Swallowing hard, I prayed that the creature hadn't yet found me, determined to remain absolutely still. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as I lay there, paralyzed with fear, while the creature prowled the forest, searching for its prey. but I couldn't endure the terror any longer. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I slowly rose to my feet, clutching my bag tightly. With a swift motion, I hurled it into the woods, hoping to distract the creature long enough for me to make my escape. As soon as it hit the ground, I bolted, running for the safety of the parking lot as fast as my legs would carry me. The shrill, guttural screech of the creature echoed behind me as I ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I sprinted blindly, not recognizing anything until I collided with a sign that read National Forest. Ignoring the pain, I pressed on, driven by sheer desperation until I finally reached my truck. With trembling hands, I flung open the door and started the engine, the roar of the truck drowning out the sounds of the forest. I peeled out of the parking lot, gravel flying in all directions as I sped away. Glancing back in the rearview mirror, I saw the creature standing in the glow of the parking lot lights, its eyes filled with malice or perhaps hunger. I looked away and focused on the road ahead, pushing the pedal to the floor as I raced towards safety. When I finally reached civilization, I let out a sigh of relief, my body shaking with adrenaline. Glancing in the mirror, I saw that my clothes were shredded, my skin covered in dirt and blood. Determined to seek help, I drove straight to the nearest police station, my hands trembling as I recounted my harrowing ordeal. It took some time for the authorities to calm me down, but eventually, a team of game wardens and police officers was assembled to search for Drew. Despite their efforts, Drew was never found. Months passed, then years, but there was no sign of him. Eventually, my grandfather approached me and revealed a chilling truth. He explained that people had been disappearing in those woods for centuries, victims of a malevolent entity that he himself had encountered. Haunted by the memory of that night, I vowed never to return to those cursed woods again. It has been 8 long years since that fateful encounter, but the terror of that night still lingers, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks in the heart of the forest. I last saw Drew, and not a day goes by that I don't think of him. He was my best friend. Take my story as a warning. If you ever go camping, always take a weapon to protect yourself, and for God's sake, do not underestimate the stories you've heard about things that happen out there. This might have been one of those beasts of Crystal Creek from Harry K. This incident occurred on August 2nd, 2019, and to this day, I have no idea what we encountered. I'm sharing this not only to caution you, but also to seek information about what we might have seen. Feel free to judge for yourself. It was the morning of August 2nd, and for 2 days, my significant other, whom I'll refer to as Esso, and I had been camping far inland from Moeller State Park, a bit from Green Mountain Falls, right on the edge of Crystal Creek in central Colorado. It was a remote location, requiring a good hike to reach. We had set up our tent at the edge of a circular clearing in the woods, about a 10-meter diameter, with trees enclosing all sides except for a small break where a path was visible. As I stepped out of the tent, my spouse was sitting just outside, taking in the morning air. She immediately remarked that it smelled of blood. I took a deep breath and confirmed it was a heavy ozone smell mixed with the overpowering scent of fresh copper, likely a prelude to a storm. We thought nothing of it at the time and began preparing our breakfast. 6 hours later, in the afternoon, we decided to build a proper fire. Ensuring our tent was sealed up, we ventured into the woods to forage for kindling and stones to reflect the heat. We were only about 45 meters from camp when odd things began to happen. At this point, the coppery smell had completely faded, so when it returned suddenly, we noticed it right away. The air grew heavy, and the overpowering scent made us both try to cover our noses with our shirts, but we continued collecting for the fire, fighting through the urge to gag on the smell. A few minutes later, we heard something, maybe 10 meters away from us. There was a rushing sound, like an animal moving quickly, accompanied by a strange noise. It sounded like someone or something jittering their voice while mid-laugh, reminiscent of Peter Griffin's laughing but deeper and distorted, as if coming from strained vocal cords. The animal was fast, darting around in the undergrowth just beyond our line of sight. Maya and I were both terrified, afraid of encountering a potentially dangerous and bizarre creature. We quickly walked back to the camp, prepared to drop our stones and wood to run if necessary. The noise seemed to always stay close by, but never close enough for us to see what was making it. As we reached the clearing, the sound stopped altogether. Shaken by the experience, we assumed it was just an animal we weren't familiar with. We didn't lose much of our material during the rush back, so we began assembling a small fire pit. The rest of the afternoon passed uneventfully, and when night fell, we retreated into the tent before it got too dark. Sometime around 2 o'clock in the morning, Maya got up, and I woke up as well. I heard her crawling outside, then she started yelling at me, "Babe, come here." "What are you doing?" This chilled me to the bone, as I was obviously right behind her in the tent. I quickly turned on my phone's flashlight and called her name. When she turned around and saw me, her face went white. "What are you doing inside?" "You just called me from outside the tent," she stammered, her voice trembling with fear. I knew she was terrified, and I quickly rose, pulling her inside the tent. "What are you talking about?" "I've been inside the whole time." "No one's out there," I reassured her, but she looked petrified. Then, she whispered, "Harry, you're out there." My blood ran cold. She was completely convinced that someone who sounded exactly like me was calling to her from outside the tent, despite her fear. Feeling a surge of determination to appear confident and calm my partner's now extreme anxiety, I grabbed a flashlight and a small hunting knife from my backpack. Though I was far from skilled with weapons, I hoped the sight of them might intimidate whatever or whoever was lurking outside, especially if they were just trying to scare us for fun. Assuring my partner that everything would be okay, I left the tent, flashlight, and knife in hand. Looking back, I regret not simply staying inside and sleeping the night away. As I stepped into the clearing, I did a quick scan with my flashlight. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then I noticed something how the stones around the fire pit were scattered, thrown about in a seemingly random order. Bending down to pick up one of the stones, I was shocked to find it extremely hot to the touch, despite the fire having been out for hours. As I kneeled, examining the stone, the coppery smell filled my nostrils once again, stronger than ever before. Then, I heard a voice coming from right in front of me, in the darkness opposite the direction of the tent. It was my own voice, speaking the words I had said to my partner moments before. "Rory, honey, everything is fine." A sudden chill washed over me, a cold dread settling in the pit of my stomach. Without thinking, I raised my flashlight, illuminating the source of the voice. There, standing before me, was the most horrific thing I had ever encountered. It was a monstrous creature, towering over me at least 2 feet taller than my 5'10" frame. Its body resembled that of an elk, but it was grotesquely decayed and tortured looking, as if it had been stretched and twisted beyond recognition. Parts of its skin were missing or falling off, revealing its skeletal form beneath. Its skull had a distinctive, serpentine formation, and its body was draped in a loose, dirty tarp. It was horribly skinny, with flesh and skin missing around its ribs, leaving a ghastly sight that chilled me to the bone. I didn't dare examine it further. I began to inch backwards, breathless and nearly paralyzed with fear. Then, the beast emitted a blood-curdling, high-pitched scream and bolted out of the clearing. I heard the sound of leaves and branches breaking for what felt like an eternity before it finally faded into the distance. Only then did I muster the courage to return to the tent, trembling and trying to calm myself. My partner, Esso, was on the verge of breaking down, so I naturally didn't tell her the truth. I lied, telling her that I had just seen a deer and that we had surprised each other, causing the creature to scream. I reassured her that there was nothing outside to fear, and we both attempted to sleep, though I'm certain neither of us truly rested, consumed by fear at every stray noise outside the tent. As soon as daylight broke, we hastily packed up and left. As we did, I noticed the pattern the stones had formed a narrow arch resembling a crescent moon, bending around where our tent had been pitched. Suffice it to say, I have never been more terrified than I was that night in the woods. I still have no idea what I encountered, but perhaps someone hearing this story will. Whatever it was, I hope it stays confined to Crystal Creek, Colorado. If you're planning a camping trip in that area anytime soon, I urge you to reconsider. As for me, I'll be choosing a different destination. Stay safe, and good luck. As for the story from Louie about the school camping trip, it's chilling to think that all 11 people woke up from nightmares on the same night. Such a collective experience is undeniably eerie and unsettling. It's moments like these that remind us of the mysteries and dangers that can lurk in the darkness of the wilderness. I kept seeing glimpses of people out of the corner of my eyes. I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. We went through the day and got back to camp around 6 p.m. We had dinner, and then everyone settled into their own world. I ended up going to bed around 9 o'clock, but I woke up at 1:34 a.m. At first, I thought I had to go to the bathroom, but then I heard them. It was 3 of my friends who had passed away in the last 2 years. Their deaths were very hard on me, and hearing their voices out of nowhere scared and tormented me. I curled up into a ball and cried while they kept saying, "Louie, come here, come with us, Louie." This went on for what felt like hours until I finally worked up the courage to wake my best friend up. He was sleeping in the same tent as me. He knows me very well and can help calm me down no matter what. I woke him, crying my heart out to him. He got up, talked to me, and kept me company until I calmed down. But after that, I had the urgent need to go to the bathroom. But, of course, I was far too scared to go by myself. My friend got up with me, and we went over to the outhouse. After I did my business, I walked out to see my friend staring up at the sky. I asked what he was looking at, and he pointed up at the moon. I looked up, and as soon as I did, I felt this wave of nausea hit. I threw up my dinner immediately, but that snapped my friend out of his trance of the moon. After I was done, we jogged back to the tent, and we remained there until I fell asleep. I have no clue what was in those woods, but it was dark, and I think it was evil. My friend has told me that ever since that trip, he has had trouble sleeping. He sees and hears things at night. We have no idea what's happening, but whatever was out there that night, it probably came home with us. As for the backyard camping experience from Michael 131, I don't remember how old I was. I believe I was 7 years old. We had just moved in next door to our neighbor, whom we've known for about 15 years and was basically family. It was the 4th of July. I just got back from Wyoming. We had asked our neighbor if we could gather a bunch of our friends and camp in her backyard. She said yes, so we set up some tents and watched the fireworks before heading to our tents for the night. Sometime during the night, my sister had gotten up to go to the bathroom. She soon came back, seemingly uneventful. Later that evening, we heard huffing noises outside the tent. Mind you, bears around our parts in a rural village in Ohio are uncommon. We don't have a dense enough forest to house bears. Usually, it's just coyotes, deer, and smaller predators. But it was a full moon, so we could see pretty well. Just outside the tents, it was a well-lit field. Keep this in mind. The footsteps and huffing noises kept circling the tents, and everyone heard it. As it approached my tent, I made out the unmistakable figure of a bear, seemingly searching for food or other scavenging opportunities. All of us were unarmed as the massive creature began to paw and bite at the tent, easily creating ribbons out of the tent nylon. I'm not sure if it knew I was inside the tent, but it definitely wanted inside. Suddenly, one of my friends screamed, and the thing bounded away before it could get all the way in. This was terrifying. Imagine growing up in an area where bears don't exist, only to wake up in the middle of the night in a tent as one begins to chew through the wall. I'm so glad it was scared away. Apparently, it wasn't that hungry. If you're wondering where the bear came from, it was apparently an escaped bear from a local zoo, and it just happened to come our way. As for the little girl from Bergerter, I was visiting some of my girlfriend's friends in her hometown of Rock Creek, British Columbia, Canada. It's one of those towns that has a gas station, a restaurant, a bar, and a couple of local shops. Very little there. Her family owns an acreage there consisting of a long driveway, a kind of rundown house, a shop, and a small animal enclosure with barns. It was summer and gets very warm that time of year in the area, so we decided to set up a tent on the deck of the shop and sleep outside. The shop is 2 stories, so the deck is fairly high up. We spent the day with her friend. It was getting late, so we decided to go set up our makeshift camp. Her friend said she might come by at some point and hang out later, so off we went back to the property. When we got there, it was a bit windy, but it was a clear summer night. We set up a propane fire pit and just hung out for a bit. It got dark, and we were tired from traveling that day, so we went to bed, figuring her friend decided not to come. This is when things got weird. Not more than 10 minutes after being in bed, we heard a girl laughing in the distance. It was close enough, it sounded like it was from the driveway area. We assumed her friend came up after all, so we crawled out of our tents and set up the chairs again. We waited, and no one came around. We chalked it up to the wind. We got back into bed, and not more than 10 minutes went by before we heard it again. This girl laughing sounded closer this time, but now we were creeped out, so we didn't want to investigate. I know most people want the juicy tale of some grotesque sight, but screw that. I was not going out there after the second time. We didn't hear it again, and we eventually fell asleep, still blaming the wind. The following day, we mentioned the story to her dad. He told us a tale about some years back, before he bought the farm in the 70s. There was a family that lived there, a man, his wife, and daughter. The daughter was apparently killed in a farming accident. She was backed over by a tractor. I've been to the property since, but I'll never go back at night after hearing that story. I'm glad I stayed in the tent. It circled my tent all night. From James's Coal, location unknown. It was the early 1980s, and my dad and uncle both bought a summer home in the countryside, which had some beautiful dense woods behind it. We would often go there over the summer and enjoy the serenity of nature away from the city. At that time, my cousin and I would hang out a lot together, and we spent many hours hiking deep into those woods behind the house. Being independent kids, we decided to take my dad's camping equipment and set up an overnight campsite about 100 feet away from the house. We did this every day, and it became our favorite summer activity. Our parents were always nearby in the house, and they kept their windows open so they could easily see and hear us. They were totally okay with us being alone in the woods at night, and sometimes even encouraged us to spend more time out there, even when we didn't feel like it. One particular summer, we almost didn't go because my uncle had to go out of state. I had been eagerly anticipating the trip all year, so I was devastated when I heard that we wouldn't be going after all. It meant that I'd have to go to day camp with all those annoying kids from school, and they didn't treat me too kindly. Being a 5-hour drive north, my parents weren't keen on making the trip without my uncle and his family, so the answer was initially no. However, I wasn't one to give up easily, and I made the summer pretty difficult whenever I could. I constantly mentioned to them how they could make it better for me, trying my best to convince them with whatever tactic I thought would work. To my surprise, my constant nagging seemed to have worked on them, because one day, they finally gave in. Later, I realized that it was probably because a family friend decided to come along with us and make the trip worth our while. Anyway, we traveled together for 5 straight hours and finally reached our destination. I could smell that pine wood scent again as I got ready to build my campsite. It took a little longer than usual because I was alone, but I got it all set up nice and dandy. I'd gone camping enough times before with my cousin, and I felt more than confident to be alone in the dark. Although I did decide to set up my tent a bit closer to the house, just in case. The sun began to set, and as I glanced at my watch, it was 8:35 p.m. There was this unusual quietness that made me a bit anxious, but I usually chatted with my cousin and just thought. I never noticed it, not until now. Part of our camping experience was reading science fiction novels until we got tired and fell asleep, and for that night, I brought an exciting new book I had wanted to read for some time. Flashlight in one hand and book in the other, I began to read. This flashlight was one of those heavy metal ones that often flickered out. I'd have to hit it a couple of times, and that would usually do the trick. It must have been around 4 a.m. when I was suddenly awakened by the sound of something brushing against my tent. At first, I wasn't sure if I had just imagined it or not, or if it was some rabbit that had passed by. But I quietly sat up for a moment and listened to my surroundings. There were no sounds and nothing special to hear, so I assumed it was just a small animal, and I tried to fall back to sleep. A few minutes passed by, and I was about to doze off when something about 40 feet away from me made this freakishly angry feline growl that turned into what sounded like a woman with an old hoarse voice. A cold shiver suddenly ran down my spine, and my thoughts began to race through my head as I imagined what it could be. It sounded human, but it also sounded like an animal. I thought of yelling for my mom and dad, but I was way too scared to even make a sound. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, but instantly I realized the mistake I had made as the growl suddenly became quiet. I quickly shut off the light and hid under my sleeping bag, hoping that it did not hear me or that it had not seen my light. To my horror, it slowly approached and stopped right outside my tent. For a while, I just stood there, breathing loudly, and each breath sounded raspy and was full of moist pops and clicks, like its throat was filled with far too much saliva. I thought maybe it would go away if I just waited, but several more minutes passed and the thing did not move. I could hear its head moving back and forth like it was trying to find me or sense where I was, but I didn't dare to breathe or move a muscle. Every so often, it would scratch the wall of the tent. My heart was racing as it tested the walls, seemingly thinking about coming inside, but I prayed and prayed that it didn't. I waited every single minute feeling like an entire hour. It kept circling me, walking and rubbing itself against the tent all night, trying to find a way to get to me, but it luckily never did. It wasn't until dawn broke when the sun started to come up that I finally heard it scurry away, and I no longer heard it. When my parents found me, they said that I was white as snow and couldn't move. I was in such a state of shock that they rushed me to the hospital right away, and I stayed there for a couple of days. I only recovered a few months later, but I still get chills every time I share this story with people. I never went camping for many years after that, but I eventually did start camping again with a few buddies of mine. Over the years, I never did go back into the woods alone. My dad eventually sold the house to some couple who lives there to this very day, and I never experienced anything like it since. What could it have been? I can't tell you. Maybe it was just some crazy old woman, or maybe it really was a monster watching me from the dark. From Bananaconda, location unknown. I was 18 years old camping with a couple of my friends. It was snowy and biting cold winds battered our flimsy tents. We all sat outside on log benches surrounding a campfire. The fire snapped and popped as the sun dipped below the black trees, and when the light was gone, we all fell silent, staring at the fire for about 30 minutes. We sat there in silence until the friend next to me stood up and declared that he was going off to bed. After that, the rest of us decided that there would be no more talk or stories that night, and we also slowly receded into our tents. Later on, we were all awakened by a loud and piercing scream. I stepped outside the tent to investigate and was shortly joined by the others. The younger friends began discussing what may have made that sound and were quickly hushed by the others. One of my friends went to grab a flashlight. He brought it out and pointed it into the forest, but did not turn it on. Instead, he shivered a bit, then handed it to me. "You turn it on," he said. I took it from him and flicked it on. The beam shone through the trees, and a pair of eyes shone back. Everyone gasped. The eyes were about 30 yards in front of us, larger than a man's and solid white. They reflected the flashlight beam perfectly well, and they seemed to swell with excitement. I couldn't see any other part of the creature. We all stood there, watching it, and it watched us. This continued for a while, us staring at it as it blinked only occasionally, as if to show us that, yes, this was, in fact, some creature watching us. After about an hour, I was as tired as I was scared. I set up the flashlight, pointing at the eyes still, then went back into my tent with the flap still open so that I could watch the eyes. I didn't plan to sleep, though I was soon out cold. I woke up sometime after. It was still dark. I peered outside the tent flap, and I saw that the eyes were gone. I closed the flap, shivered with relief, and went to sleep. The next morning, we woke up to find footprints in the snow that we didn't recognize. They circled our tents a number of times. This unnerved me to my core. I asked them if they'd been up walking around that night, and we all said no. We left quickly after that and never figured out what we saw. A near encounter with the Wendigo, from Leprechaun, location unknown. This took place on a camping trip on September 7th, 2018. I wasn't originally planning on going camping. I just wanted to kick back for the day, but two of my close friends, Jack and Chase, came over with camping gear because they said the day looked quite nice to be out. I was slightly against it at first as I had an eerie encounter a few years back, but they pressed me on it, and I soon gave in. It took me a while to get ready, but soon we were on our way to the nearby woods. By the time we got to the spot we were going to, it was basically night, so we rushed to set up the tents and start a fire before it got extremely dark. Eventually, we managed to get a decent fire going, and for most of the night, things were going as per usual. It was quiet and chill, that is until the sun was completely gone from the horizon. When it was pitch black, the rain came down hard, and we were forced to retreat into our tents. Chase and I shared a smaller tent, while Jack got his own larger one. The three of us were discussing how we could pass the time. We weren't tired yet, and by 3 a.m., we were still up, and that's around the time things went even further south. We heard Jack from the other tent suddenly hush us. When it went quiet, we heard footsteps around us, and we all went silent. Chase looked as worried as I did, and me being skeptical about these things, I was thinking of all the possible things it could be. Some trespasser on our campsite, any hiker that stumbled upon our camp, some kid playing a prank. I then decided to quietly look outside, so I pulled the tent zipper to the side, and slowly and cautiously, I peeped out. But as soon as I did, my heart froze. Standing in the middle of our campsite was a white figure. They weren't wearing any clothes, and they were thin and frail. They appeared to be looking around our campsite rather curiously. Chase must have been watching my face and saw the horrid look on it because he began to freak out. I looked over and silently placed a finger over my lips to quiet him. We stayed there silent for about an hour before we decided to slowly creep out to look around. The only form of protection we had at the time was a quorum bit my friend brought and my Leatherman. It really wasn't much, and I was hoping we didn't need to use them. When we stepped out into the campsite, we saw nothing. We walked around, but never saw the thing that I'd seen through the flap. We crowded around the fire and restarted it. I was worried, but eventually, I calmed down. After staying out for a little while, a sense of safety returned to us, and we felt ready to crawl back into our tents for some rest. But just as Jack was crawling into his tent flap, Chase grabbed me from behind by my shoulder and pointed into the woods. I followed his finger, and when my eyes adjusted, my mouth hung open. It was standing now, right in the woods, back facing us. It was so emotionless, I felt frozen in place, not wanting to alarm it. But when we heard the sound coming from it, we almost screamed. "Please help me," the words came out in a slow, forced manner. The creature itself was tall and lanky, and its limbs were long, almost exaggerated. As we stared at it, it suddenly fell to all fours and ran, disappearing into the woods. Its movement was more like an insect than a person. As soon as we had the courage to move again, We all hid in the same tent, scared and wide awake. None of the three of us spoke a word until sunrise when it was light out. We packed up as quickly as possible and got out of Dodge, but the whole trip home I felt like we were being watched, followed. The expression on the other guys' faces, I'll never forget it. It's no wonder they refused to speak of it after we made it back home. I don't think any of us will forget this experience. Sinister indeed. I've had two experiences that solidify my belief in creatures that are beyond our understanding. I'll share one of these experiences with you. It was my first encounter. I was 17 years old, going on a horseback riding trip with my father and his friends. We were riding the trails of a hilly area called East Fork, where thick woods and tall cliffs made for beautiful scenery during the ride, broken only by the occasional camp area or stable for riders to rest their horses for the night. We spent all day riding, starting around 10 o'clock that morning and continuing until around 7 o'clock in the evening. Along the way, we met other riders and even had lunch with one group whose paths we crossed on several occasions throughout the trails. During the ride, my dad and I got into an argument about me being on my phone while we rode. Afterwards, he complained about it to his friends frequently during the rest of the ride. After we finally stopped and made camp, I confronted him about keeping on about it all day. After heated words were thrown by each of us, I finally yelled at him about being stubborn, and I stomped off through the woods. I wandered around for about 30 minutes, cooling off, when I ran across another campsite. This happened to be the group we had shared lunch with that afternoon. The group had been a family of 6, 1 woman, 2 men, 1 teenage girl, and 2 younger kids, a boy and a girl. One of the men, named Tom, greeted me cheerfully when he saw me and asked where the rest of my troop was. I told him I was just taking a walk to get some time away from my dad. He chuckled, then asked if I wanted to join them for dinner, saying he would walk me back to my father's camp afterwards. Smelling the food, my stomach rumbled, sealing our agreement. I sat down around the fire they had, and I was introduced to his family, whom I'd only met briefly earlier that day. The other man was Tom's brother, Keith. The woman was Tom's wife, Kathleen, and their 3 kids, Jordan, Molly, and Brian, the latter 2 being twins. After the names were all said and remembered, I chatted with Jordan and Tom while Kathleen set out plates on the card table that they were using for dinner preparations. Keith called over, saying dinner was ready, and we all ate, laughed, and talked for a while. As we were finishing up, Keith excused himself to use the restroom behind the camper they had set up next to their campsite. Jordan and I continued to chat while Tom strummed on an old guitar that he had pulled out. Once we had finished eating, Kathleen had gone to tuck the twins into bed inside the camper. Around then, Tom offered to walk me back to my cab. It was getting late, so I agreed, and we both stood. Suddenly, Jordan froze, and between us, we looked at her as she turned pale, a look of silent terror crossing her face as she stared behind us towards the end of the camper. Tom and I both turned and looked to see a tall, lean, and nightmarish creature. It was at least 9 feet tall, not including the antlers on its head. Its body was extremely muscular and lanky at the same time. Its head was barely similar to a deer skull, with only bits of skin still hanging in places. Its arms were clawed, one of which was holding onto a fresh bit of meat. Tom audibly cursed, and Jordan screamed. I was frozen with fear, staring at something that did not make sense to me, something that just shouldn't exist. Hearing the commotion, Kathleen came out of the camper, a Remington in her hands. One look at the thing in front of her family, her eyes grew wide, and her mouth slunk open. She fired, although I am not sure she was even trying to. Though she hit it, the creature screamed and then ran off into the woods, pounding the soil underneath it all the while, releasing this hellish shriek. It was the worst sound I'd ever heard. After it ran off, Tom ordered everyone into the camper and started calling out for his brother, but Keith did not answer. He grabbed a flashlight and handed me one, asking me, "No, begging me to help him look but to stay close to the camper. We didn't have to look very far. We found what remained of Keith about 10 feet into the woods behind the camper. His pants were still undone from relieving himself. There were bites taken out of his face and stomach, and his arm was gone, which I later realized was what the creature had been holding in its claw. Kathleen had called the park rangers while we had gone out to look, and maybe 20 minutes later, they showed up with 2 police officers. We were all thoroughly questioned, and the remains were looked at. After the cops finished talking to me, they called my dad and informed him of where I was and why they had been calling. While they spoke to him on the phone, I heard him say that I had been a witness to a bear attack. I was stunned. That wasn't a bear. I never even spoke of a bear in my statement. Did they even look at the remains? In no way whatsoever did this attack resemble a bear. After a while, my dad came and picked me up, asking if I was okay. I nodded, then bid goodbye to the traumatized family who had been so kind to me earlier, yet now looked lost and confused, a feeling that I understood completely. Strange creature in the woods from Fed Upon Location, Texas and Oklahoma. I've been hunting all my life, and I've never been afraid of the woods, and I've never believed in Bigfoot, shapeshifters, or goat men or anything like that. But in May 2012, I went snake hunting camping in eastern Texas and Oklahoma. I had been warned that bears were causing trouble at campsites and that I should stay at only marked campsites. But I'm not one to do as I'm told, for better or for worse. So I took my German Shepherd and Odex. After a hard day of hunting for dens, I was tired and wanted to go to sleep. It was 4:45 a.m. when my dog started barking, waking me up and wanting to be out of the tent no matter how many times I told him to be quiet. He wouldn't let it go. Finally, I grew tired of his barking and let him out. He took off to the edge of the clearing and stopped. I knew by the way he was acting that he was after something. I grabbed my aunt's 6 o'clock and went toward the dog. I hadn't gotten more than 25 yards when the dog crawled out of the woods. He was limping badly, and only a few seconds later, I saw something coming after it, a large black creature standing on hind feet. I yelled for whoever it was that I was armed and that they better show themselves. Receiving no answer, I fired with a warning, but the thing didn't budge. I backed up and looked toward my dog. He needed to get to a vet fast. He was hurt pretty bad. I picked him up, and I ran toward my truck. I managed to make it inside, and I went back to town. I called the local sheriff as well, but he told me to call the game warden right away. I said that I was going to the vet, and I was told that he would meet me there. The vet said that they would need to keep the dog for about a week, and when the game warden arrived, he began asking about the creature that I saw. We ended up taking his truck back to the campsite, which was now all torn to shreds. The ice chest had been turned over and emptied, and the poles from the tent had been tossed in a nearby tree. I showed him the spot in the woods where I saw it. There, we found a very obvious trail of fluids and fur. We followed it for a mile or two, which again was strangely easy. The creature didn't even attempt to hide its path. But suddenly, the trail just stopped, as if the creature disappeared. I was confused, but the warden was terrified. He said that we needed to leave now and that he had the feeling that if we went any further, we'd be walking into a trap. I decided to listen to his rather ominous advice. We went back to his truck and drove back to town. I don't really know what the thing was that I saw. I've been back to that area twice, and now my dog is too afraid to go out of the tent. Those words spoken by the warden haunt me to this day because what sort of animal is out there setting up traps for people, one that scared even the game warden when both of us were armed?